as advertised, I am going to talk today a little bit about two things in 20 short minutes. First, I want to tell you very briefly about work going on around the globe to move our understanding generally about what patients are saying from anecdote to science. And that doesn't mean depriving it of all of its richness and texture and meaning. It means keeping that person that Candace talked about being at the center, but making sure that we have access to voices that don't usually get heard when researchers go out and try to say, well, what are people saying? And that seems like a really important thing to focus on at a policy consortium like this. And then, as forecasted by Gwen, I'm going to share some preliminary results from a project that we're doing, moving from voice to voices about experiences with inherited cancer and cancer risk. And I'm going to devote most of my time to playing you some clips from that research. Here's that concept of moving narratives from anecdote to science, and some of the ways that we do that are to focus explicitly on sampling, who are we going to talk to, on eliciting stories, not just going for the usual suspects who get their narratives out there by talking to the press or testifying before Congress or blogging. Those voices are heard, and that's important in the public discourse, but we want to make sure that we're getting that breadth. Rigorous analysis using qualitative methods, and that interpretive act of really understanding what we're hearing from multiple people. This work is going on around the globe using a methodology called the Database of Individual Patient Experiences, or DIPEX, that was pioneered at Oxford. And why do we do this work? Because it marries qualitative research with publicly accessible web-based resources. And I'm going to give you a little preview of what our work on genomics is going to look like when it hits the web about 6 months from now. So through this methodology, we identify questions that matter to patients. We have a way of democratizing access to information so that patients can hear directly and people can hear directly what's happening to families and to people using healthcare. We also can impact clinical practice, quality improvement, medical education, and system change and policy, our focus for today. Here's just a really brief few bullets about how this methodology works. There's a lot more available in a webinar that I did the last time Gwen asked me to do something, and I, of course, said yes, and that is archived on the NPATH website and also on the website that I'm going to show you. So really briefly, we aim for maximum variation, so looking for the quiet voices, for the less heard voices, going into places around the country to talk to people about their experiences, much like being a community health worker, more like being a community health worker who has that capacity to talk to broad people than like being a standard researcher in an academic medical center. And we do qualitative interviews, which, as you'll see, we videotape and we get permission from people. They can always say they don't want us to use pieces or later tell us they don't want us to use it. And we do that until we feel like we really have our arms wrapped around whatever topic we're studying. This is happening in now 14 countries around the world, including Brazil, who has just joined our international collaborative. And in the US, we're implementing it using a network model that has nodes in these various spots you see on the map. So our web-based resources are available at www.healthexperiencesUSA.org, and that's what the front of the website looks like if you click. We're doing this work, this voice-to-voices work, on a variety of topics. Some of them are up already, as you can see in the first box there, and today I'm going to talk to you about what we're learning about genomic or genetic medicine and cancer. Here's a glimpse of our fantastic study team. And really briefly, the qualitative research study, now in the process of being turned into a web-based resource that features clips from these videotapes interviews that have been analyzed for both theme and variation and will be available on the web, focused on wrapping our arms around, and I want to thank the NHGRI working group and Vince Bonham and Gwen and other people in this room for helping us figure out how to find and define the scope of this study so that we'd have our finger on at least one of the pulses of what's going on at this cutting edge. So we focused on high-risk syndromes like Lynch, BRCA and PALB2 and polyposis syndromes. We focused on talking to people who have strong family histories but no identified markers, as well as people who have those markers, and really at that intersection where genetics, genomics, and family history meet, to talk to people who have really meaty stories. And what I'm going to share with you now, like what Vince shared, is our preliminary analysis. These are just some of the themes that have come out of the qualitative research process, and I'm going to, for each of them, share with you a little bit of what we've learned from specific people who have told their stories for this study. So first, the impact on families of genetic testing. We're hearing a variety of stories here, as you might imagine, and we've already heard from the 2 sessions this morning many of the themes that came up here. From some people, primarily Caucasian folks that we're interviewing, heritable information that's coming through the increased capacity to drill down and test for things like Lynch syndrome or polyposis syndromes to know what people's specific mutations are and trace them back, is becoming part of family culture. So Gina's family has a special Facebook page to help them monitor risk, and in Cynthia's family, chats about risk are talked about sort of along with the weather at family gatherings. Barry hasn't talked with his sister, who's his remaining relative, who hasn't already died of a cancer-related condition, about her risk in getting tested because, like was mentioned on both of the panels earlier, she has much more pressing issues around her diabetes. And for Charlene, as with many people, her family just doesn't want to get tested, and she's sort of bumping her head up against this, the many reasons that people say, I don't want to do this. Here is Asanti, and I'm going to play her clip in just a moment, who, like a number of people of color we're interviewing, and has again been mentioned earlier today, talks about the deep suspicion about testing that is predominant in her family. Here's Asanti.
Until we can advocate for ourselves in a real way that's going to make real change, I can talk until I'm blue in the face to tell my dad to get genetic testing, and he is not going to do it. He comes from an era where, horrible things happened. And so I think that's where we're at. But I think it takes us, the younger generation, to, try and advocate and be advocates to say, there are a few doctors that you can trust. Mm-hmm. There are a few, but the best thing you can do is be your own, know your body, mm-hmm. Talk to each other. You don't have to go to the genetic testing person, right. But we can talk to each other. You can know how your great-grandmother died by asking your grandmother. You can know how your aunt died by asking people. Talk to each other.
Second theme, we're hearing many rich stories about people's interactions with healthcare around genetics and genomics and testing, both good and bad. And we're hoping, again, from a system change level, that having these many clips on the web will help improve clinical practice and quality improvement and help people who are every day working with patients and families understand the variety and depth of their experiences. Jan Lynn here was tested for Lynch without her knowledge and remains very upset that she didn't know the testing was happening and got this information in a surprising and sort of unwelcome way. Paul talks about experiencing what he describes as scanxiety. Every time he goes for screening, a new word that he coined for the particular kind of anxiety that comes when you're regularly monitoring because your genetic marker has been identified and you know your risk is high. Desiree is that person that Vince mentioned, or a person that represents this community of people who's very well insured, and yet her insurance wasn't good enough to cover the more specific tests she needs to see if her cancer is heritable or not and be able to do that work with her family that she very much wants to happen. And Hortensia talks about how her healthcare providers need to be more human. She wants to be treated like a beating heart rather than a sick breast. And here's Lisa echoing something we've heard from many interviews about just how hard it is to absorb the information you're getting.
The geneticist 3 years ago, they give you a whole lot of information. Blah, 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 blah. And when it came to the breast, she says, well, we can, right away, after the ovaries, she said, well, after we take out your ovaries, she said, we can do a mastectomy and take off your breasts. Or I'm like, no, they're fine. I don't really understand why you'd want to do that. And I don't think I really understood the significance, because I know that a lot of younger people do that. And I don't think I understood that. I was lucky it came back at DCIS, which means it was stage 0. It could have come back as stage 2 or stage 3 or invasive, which a lot of I look at the Facebook support pages, and most of the women, it's invasive. And they do chemo and radiation. And that's why they get rid of their breasts first. I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to do the chemo and radiation. Yeah, I lucked out. In a sense that, lucked out, I say that, and I had to take off my breasts, but I got to have them on for 3 more years. It wasn't invasive. I didn't have to do chemo and radiation. But I didn't understand enough about what the BRCA meant.
We're hearing a lot in these interviews, and we've now done about 43 of them. We've got about 10 more planned about how uncertainty permeates people's experiences. This is a theme that Gwen mentioned at the beginning of the day. We see different kinds of uncertainty talked about. Being at that cutting edge where, as Paul puts it, I specialize in rare. Everything that happens, I'm the first one or maybe the second one, and the doctors and the clinicians and the teams are trying to figure that out. Lori is struggling with that uncertainty we've heard a lot about of whether she'll be safe or not. She doesn't have cancer, but it always feels like ... yet. Jack talks about being aware that there's not enough evidence yet to know which cancers really run in families or about what kinds of treatments are going to work well for which people. And Jan Lynn senses that her doctors act a lot more certain than they can really reasonably be. Here's Virginia talking about finding out firsthand just how quickly personalized medicine is evolving.
I'm trying to remember. I think it was after I was diagnosed that they put us in touch with the Genetic Counseling Center. And they said, we think you're odd enough as a family that we should do some testing. I think paid for the BRCA1, BRCA2 type test. And then when my mother and I came along, all of a sudden it was kind of a family cluster. They said, we want you to have this testing. They did find a gene in common that they referred to as PAL-B2, and they described it as pals around with BRCA2. And it's kind of interesting because at the time they said this is a finding of unknown significance. And then they came back a year later and said this is a finding of no known significance. So they changed sort of their mind. They're basically saying it means you're related. We don't think it has any bearing on the fact that the three of you have breast cancer.
Finally, we find that an exceptionally useful part of each of these DIPEX websites is the collection of messages people we interview give directly to family and friends of people who are having experiences with genomic medicine, to clinicians, and to other people, patients facing similar challenges. So making these messages publicly available, as we shortly will, on our website is itself, I believe, a system change intervention, a way that people move genomics forward in their own way, advising one another and providing textured, actionable feedback to people in the healthcare system. So before turning it over to Drew, who's going to really pick up, I think, on some of these themes around the nature of narratives and the public discourse and how we can think about that systematically, we're going to listen to just a couple of these messages. Thomas is going to talk to us, tell us what his messages would be to healthcare providers.
We know you the doctor. We know you went to school for all of this. We know, but you got to realize you're not dealing with me every day. You don't see me every day. You see hundreds of us every day.
Right.
You don't see the same person every day. So we know what you're going through, but then again, you chose that profession. You said you had the willpower to go through and deal with this.
Right.
We don't know you. When we come into your hospital, we have to get to know you.
Yeah.
You already pretty much know us by our charts.
Yeah.
We have to get to know you. Y'all have to listen to us because we know our bodies.
And then finally, here is Sarah's message to other people with genetically linked cancer.
What kind of messages would you give to a woman who is just coming down your path? She's 19 months behind you.
I'm sorry. That's what I would say. I'm sorry this is happening. I would say, you got this. You got this. You're going to get a lot of advice. Don't take all of it. Sort through it for yourself. Do what you can. Don't do everything. Don't let other people make it about them. You just got a cancer diagnosis. This is about you. If you have friends who are very, 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 very upset that you have cancer, and you are finding that you have to comfort them because you have cancer, don't do it. That person has to be cut out right now. You've got way more important things to do than to make sure that they're emotionally okay. Make it about you, because it is. Trust your heart. And if somebody tells you no and you think you should get a yes, get a second opinion, get a third opinion. Trust your heart. You got this.
So, in conclusion, I think what patients have to say is critically important, and hearing that means moving from one voice or the idea that there could possibly be a standardized patient to a variety of voices that we listen hard for, because structural disadvantage means we don't hear equally from everyone unless we try really, really hard to do it. Check out our website if you have time. And I just want to acknowledge our funding, which makes all this work possible. And over to you.
So thank you, Rachel, for that really powerful presentation, and it's great to hear all those patient narratives. I recognize that I'm the last speaker before lunch, and so I'll try not to take too much time. I only have 3 hours of prepared material, so. I want to talk about the power of story, but I want to start by proposing a question. And the question that I want us to think about today is, what is the difference between 20 and 24 million? So those are both estimates from the Congressional Budget Office and others on the number of people that might lose health insurance if the Affordable Care Act was repealed. Now, one way to answer the question is simple. It's 4 million. That's a huge number. It means that potentially 4 million people's lives hang in the balance. But another way to answer the question is 0. There is no difference between 20 and 24 million, just as there's no difference between 10 and 20 and 30 million. And I say that because those numbers are too large. They're too abstract for our minds to meaningfully grasp. It's not the way that people think. It's not the way that they reason. It's certainly not what moves them to action on the behalf of others. So on a policy level, on a political level, on a public health level, there's very little difference in the motivational force to try to impetus for people to do something new or try something differently between 20 and 24 million. So you might say that the mathematical delta between 20 and 24 is 4, but the motivational delta is close to 0. And so today I want to argue that the truth lies somewhere in between those two answers. The truth is somewhere between the obvious, the straightforward answer of 4 million, and the less obvious, the more provocative answer of 0. Because numbers are important, but numbers are only numbers until we give them life. They have to be put in the right context for us to help them have real-world impact. We have to know, we have to feel the lives of the people that are affected by those numbers. And that might seem like an obvious point. It's because it is. There's nothing new, there's nothing novel about what I'm saying. The idea that stories can be used to create change is one of the most ancient insights that we have, but I don't think it's one that we use effectively enough. We can do a better job of reaching people, whether they're patients or families or funders or policymakers, in new and interesting and more creative ways. So whatever your views are on the last presidential election, I think what is obvious is that people didn't necessarily vote based on facts or policies or character or temperament. People bought into a particular narrative, a particular story about what was going on in the world around them, and that is ultimately what carried the day. And so we can use this insight in healthcare as well. We can take the knowledge that we have, the knowledge that we produce, and we can infuse it with narrative to try to create change. And so when I'm talking about narrative, I'm really talking about two types of narrative. The first is the narrative that we've been talking about a lot today, the use of human narrative. That's patient stories, those are family stories, those are the stories of real patients and clinicians that are living in the real world. And we've heard so many of those stories today, and they've been so beautifully and powerfully told. But there's another type of story, and it's a story about the larger narrative around who we are as a country, who we are as a health system, how do the lives of patients and clinicians fit into that larger story of progress. And for that story, we need data. We need to tell the story of large and persistent and sometimes even growing health disparities for certain groups of Americans. We need to talk about research that has found that nearly 80% of individuals in genomic studies are of European descent. Only 2% are of African descent. Only 1% of Hispanic. We need to talk about how a lot of these problems of underrepresentation and marginalization will probably get worse as we move into an era of automation and artificial intelligence. We need to talk about how access to precision medicines, to genomic testing, are increasingly out of the reach of many people who cannot afford the cost of innovation. So for me, the idea that you can merge personal narrative with larger policies is one that has been ingrained in my life from the very beginning. So the first memories of my life are of my sister, who was lying inside of an incubator, struggling to breathe. My mother went into labor at just 26 weeks, and doctors told my parents that if she survived, she would likely have profound cognitive or physical disabilities. Praying that she wouldn't, my parents named her Karishma, which means miracle in Hindi. So this was 1990. My dad was having some trouble finding the type of work that he wanted to do in England. My parents were considering moving back to India, and they thought that the social stigma around disability would prevent my sister from realizing her full potential. 1990 was also the year that the United States was passing landmark legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which declared that physical and mental disabilities in no way diminish a person's right to fully participate in all aspects of society. And I think that that law, that sentiment, played a huge role in my parents' decision to move here, to move to the United States. And it ultimately allowed my sister to have all the opportunities that she needed to thrive. So she was ultimately diagnosed with cerebral palsy. She uses forearm crutches to get around, but she's never let that stop her from doing any of the things that she wants to do. She's been able to ski and horseback ride with assistance. She was valedictorian of her high school. She went to an Ivy League college, and she's now practicing as a radiation oncologist in New Jersey. And so hers is a story of progress. It's the story of how, when we have the appropriate policies in place, it can really allow people to thrive. And for those of us caring for patients, storytelling is really at the heart of what we do every day. The act of understanding who a person is, what they have been through, why they are presenting to care, that at its heart is an act of story gathering and storytelling. As clinicians, we're trying to take medical history and medical evidence and turn it into a coherent narrative that makes sense to ourselves and that makes sense to our patients. But often this is not an easy task. So it's not easy to communicate effectively about health and science, in part because science by its very nature is messy. It's constantly being overturned. It's constantly being updated. Often when we see coverage of new science, it can look something like this. So everything you eat both causes and prevents cancer. Here we see that coffee, corn, eggs, and milk are all somehow both cancer-causing and cancer-protective. On the other side, you can see that you need somewhere between 5 and 10 servings of fruits and vegetables to live a long, healthy life, or maybe just kidding, it doesn't really matter at all. Now, one recent study found that half of new studies that are covered by newspapers are ultimately overturned or reversed by subsequent meta-analyses. And studies that get more coverage are more likely to be overturned than studies that got less coverage. And I should note that this study itself got a lot of news coverage, so I'm not sure what that says about the validity of the findings, but suffice it to say, it's hard to talk about issues that require a lot of nuance. Now, a second challenge in the way that we're communicating in medicine is that we in medicine tend to communicate in statistics, and most people tend to think in stories. And so in medicine, we try to avoid the use of anecdote. And that is entirely appropriate a lot of the time. One of the goals of evidence-based medicine is to use data and evidence, not anecdote, to drive decision-making. We sometimes poke fun at anecdote, thinking it's a waste of time compared to our facts and studies and statistics. But I do think that there's an important distinction that we need to make here, and that's between the use of anecdote to justify a particular practice or policy and the use of anecdote to explain or to promote that practice that's rooted in data. So you wouldn't want to necessarily use a collection of anecdotes to make evidence-based decisions or policy decisions, but you might want to use a collection of anecdotes to advocate for particular policy positions that are rooted in science and rooted in data, and it's important not to get those two things confused. Now, the third issue that makes healthcare really hard to communicate about is that the language of science is very different than the language of advocacy. So on the left, you see the language of science. The patient asks, does it work? The response is, well, that depends on what you mean by does, it, and work. The language of advocacy is far more direct. So these guys, as you can see, they're not mincing any words. They are determined to take something down. Whatever that is, we'll find out at some point. So scientific language is nuanced, it's cautious. Again, that's appropriate most of the time, but there are times we have to recognize we need to communicate more forcefully and directly. But I think the biggest problem is that even on issues of established science, there can be huge discrepancies between what science knows and what the public believes. So almost all scientists believe that humans have evolved over time, but only 2/3 of US adults feel the same way. Nearly 90% of scientists think that vaccines should be required for everyone, compared to, again, about 2/3 of the general population. And nearly 90% of scientists believe that humans are contributing to global climate change. Only half of US adults feel the same way. And there's probably many reasons for these types of discrepancies. There are times where certain social or political groups benefit from certain forms of misinformation. But I also think it's on us as scientists or clinicians or advocates to communicate effectively to people. So less than 1/3 of Americans, only 31% of Americans feel like scientists are effective communicators. Most graduate programs in science don't offer any training in how to communicate about your work to lay audiences. And increasingly, there are important scientific domestic programs that are at risk of losing federal funding. The NIH, the public health insurance expansions, NASA, environmental protections, and the list goes on and on. So better communication is critical. And when we're thinking about how to communicate our stories to lay audiences, I think that there is a framework that can be incredibly effective. It's a framework that is designed by a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. His name's Marshall Ganz. And Professor Ganz was a community organizer for decades. He feels like there are 3 fundamental components to any story that creates change in the real world. He talks about the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And the framework is rooted in this ancient wisdom from the first century Jewish sage Hillel the Elder, who said that if I am not for myself, who will be for me? That's the story of self. When I am only for myself, what am I? That's the story of us. And if not now, then when? That is the story of now. So the first component of this is the story of self. That is your own story. It describes why you feel called to this issue, what experiences, what values have led you to this point. The second part is the story of us. It describes how your experiences, how your values are connected to the experiences and the values of those around you. What is your collective story? Who are your people that you're going to embark on this journey with? And finally, the third component is the story of now. It refers to why the challenge you're asking us to address is urgent right now. So today, in 2019, the advances of genomic medicines are not accessible to huge swaths of our population. There's something we need to do about that right now. So when searching for how to tie data to narrative, stories to statistics, we should think through each of those components: the story of self, the story of us, the story of now. And I'll just close by saying that whether we like it or not, we in healthcare are now part of a system that is equal parts medicine and economics and politics. And the social climate can make it hard not to feel like your responsibility extends beyond the clinic, beyond the hospital. And that is in part because as clinicians, as scientists, and advocates, we represent an increasingly rare link in an increasingly unequal society. By virtue of being in this room, we are relatively well off or well connected or well educated, but we also have a unique insight into some of the most marginalized communities. We know what people are going through on the ground. And so if for no other reason, we need to speak up to give voice to those who don't always have the opportunity to give voice to themselves.